top of the tower to the right of us, there are three figures: a mayor, a knight, and a mason. All medieval figures, but they're not actually medieval figures, if that makes sense. They were built in Victorian times when the tower was restored. This part of town we're in now, Gillygate, is where you find the independent shops, and the alternative part of York is where there's meditation centres, vegan cafe, shops selling vinyl records and crystals and dream catchers. So all sorts of things down here. Not all of it open on a Sunday, but if you're here for a few days, well worth coming down, and a lot of it is open on a Sunday anyway. So it's where you find the more unusual gifts and the things you can't find in the rest of town. Like a lot of streets in York, it's got the word gate in its name, which is a Viking word for street, come down to us from gata, and it's come down to us as gate now. There's 37 streets in York with the Viking word gate in their names, following the old Viking street plan, of course. But some of the roads were Roman roads that the Vikings were reusing. But nowadays, no Viking buildings down here on Gillygate. It's Victorian and Georgian architecture that we see. And above us on the right, some of the windows are bricked up above street level. And in Georgian times, there was a window tax. The more windows you had, the more tax you paid. So people bricked them up to avoid paying quite so much money. But there's a couple of problems with that. First of all, there was also a brick tax in those days. And secondly, it cut off a lot of the daylight coming into your house, and didn't have light switches. And they gave us the phrase daylight robbery that we still use today to describe rip-offs. Over on the right now, you can see a beautiful stretch of our city walls leading to Monk Bar in the distance. And this stretch of city walls built on a big grassy bank that is the old Viking defences that were here long before the medieval people stuck a wall on top. Over on your left is St John's University, looking a bit like Hogwarts in the frost there. This is one of two unis in York. Back over on the right, we're following the line of the city walls, and you can see some features of York Minster just beyond them. You can see the massive central tower, and you can see parts of the big window that's on the end nearest to us. It's the biggest stained glass window in the country, the size of a tennis court. Great big arched window called the Great East Window. Obviously, you know, well worth seeing close up. Although you can't see a lot of it from here, but well worth seeing it close up. It's got 300 panels of stained glass inside it. In fact, most of the country's medieval stained glass is all inside York Minster, so if you do get a chance to go in to our most famous building at some point, you have to pay, but it's well worth going in. You see all that stained glass and architecture. And you can do everything from the crypt to the top of the central tower. But if you fancy being outdoors, then there's an abandoned graveyard over on your left where there used to be a church on the corner, so if you want a picnic later on, there you go. Feeling brave. Now down the next street on the right, there's a big orange building that used to be the Victorian Hospital, but it's now been turned into flats. So if you look down the street to the right now, you'll see that. And at number 44 on the right, level with the tree, the big white door frame is where the Railway King used to live, a chap called George Hudson. Now there's a plaque outside about George Hudson, but there's not much else about him in town, because after building a third of Britain's railways, he ended up in disgrace. I'll tell you why later, it doesn't end well. So while you're in York, you've got loads of history all around you. I've mentioned the Vikings and the Victorians, but it goes back a lot further. It goes all the way back to the Romans. And about 2,000 years ago, the year AD 71, the Romans had been in the country for 28 years and they've been working their way north. And in AD 71, they were looking for a place to build a new fortress up north to control the Iron Age tribes in the area. And they found an empty triangular bit of land between our two rivers. One of those rivers of which is on your left at the moment, the River Foss. This is a smaller river in York. It leads up to the bigger one later on, the River Ouse, and then they flow out to the sea. And that's why the Romans chose this spot to build their fortress, because of the great river transport links that York then made use of for almost the next 2,000 years as an inland port, with people trading all over Europe from York for many centuries. So the Romans would use the river. They would bring in things from abroad, exotic food and drink that they couldn't get in Britain, because there was no Sainsbury's back then. So they couldn't get things like wine, and of course they loved a good drink of wine, didn't they? So they were bringing that in from the Mediterranean into York. They were bringing in loads of French pottery that's been found, figs and dates and olives and grapes, things like that. And people, of course, from all over the empire as well. And these people from the other Roman occupied lands came into York and created a town here around the fortress. The town was mainly on the railway station side of the river, so what we think of nowadays as the town where all the shops and the minster is where the fortress was originally, the Roman fortress. But it grew eventually into the place we now think of as York, except it wasn't called that back then. It was called Roman Iberacum. Then it became Anglo-Saxon Jurfwick and Viking Jorvik, before eventually becoming York, its fourth name. It becomes York during the Norman conquest, and it gets a mention in the Domesday Book, which mentions this church on the right, St. Cuthbert's. So Domesday Book mentions our famous street, the Shambles, and 1,400 properties in York by then, during the Norman conquest, but it doesn't tell us about the secret passage from the church that apparently goes under the road and takes people to the pub. Very useful, very useful. One of the most haunted pubs in York, the Black Swan. Well worth going in if you're feeling brave and you fancy a drink. Watch out for the man in the bowler hat who stands by the bar. He's a ghost. And there's a ghostly lady who sits by the fireplace, and there's a pair of disembodied legs wandering around all by themselves. So, if you're brave enough, stop number 5, just outside it. And we're coming up to stop number 6 in the centre of town now. And as you probably know, you can make use of our bus throughout the day. You can get on and off as much as you like and go exploring and get back on a later bus again. You might get a different tour guide, you might get told different things throughout the day. And stop number 6, where we are now, is one of the most popular ones, because it's very close to the shops and the Shambles and the Viking Centre, loads of other attractions. So if you want to jump off here later, you can jump back on later, get back on again. They're every half hour throughout the day. Last one from stop number 1, where you all got on. Last one from there is about 4:30, but keep checking with the drivers and sellers for any up-to-date information. And while you've got your bus ticket, you can also take advantage of some discounts with it as well. So there's attractions nearby, things like the Merchant Adventurers Hall, the Roman Bath Museum, the York Army Museum, the Chocolate Story. All of those attractions will give you a discount with your bus ticket. And they're all within walking distance from this bus stop. And a few places to eat and drink will give you money off as well, including York Gin, which is not far from here, and Drake's Fish and Chips in King's Square will also give you money off. So Drake's is up the next street on the right, and that's in King's Square, where you'll also find the Chocolate Story. Not far from here, there's also a chocolate cafe called the Cocoa Works, and that will give you a discount as well. So some of these places are on your maps, some of them are not far from here, and if you need any directions, just let us know.
Yeah, we'll go with mine.
So the Merchant Adventurers Hall is a big medieval building, a grand medieval timber frame structure not far from here, down the next couple of streets on the left. The Chocolate Story is up this street on the right. And then the next street on the right, just after the little church, is our famous Shambles. The medieval narrow cobbled street, the Shambles. So if you look to the right now, you will shortly see that. It's this one that looks a bit like the Diagon Alley out of Harry Potter, and for that reason it's now full of Harry Potter shops. It wasn't actually filmed here, but a lot of people think it was. But it's full of shops selling ghosts and potions and all sorts of things nowadays. But originally the Shambles was a street of butchers, so it wasn't quite so pretty as it is now. The blood was literally running down the middle of the street, the animals hanging outside on butchers' hooks, some of which are still visible outside the gift shops that are there now. And it's called the Shambles because of the butchers. The meat would be displayed as well on counters called shambles, which look a bit like window ledges. So if you're outside the Shambles shops later, see big wide window ledges, those are the old meat counters that give it the name. The street on the right is our main high street, Parliament Street, where you find the tourist information, places to eat and drink. Looming over us on the right are all the gargoyles of All Saints Church. The street on the left of us that we're going to go past in a second is the one that takes you down to the Viking Centre and the Coppergate shops. Coppergate was the Viking street of the cup makers. Many wooden cups were made in workshops in this area, as well as there were blacksmiths making beautiful ironwork, and there were jewellers making things out of amber from the Baltic. Look out on the left at the Three Tons pub. There's a black cat sitting above the first bay window. It's one of the many ornamental cats on the York Cat Trail. If you fancy tracking them down, there's something like 25 of them now. People keep adding cats to buildings around York, and you can enjoy wandering around and tracking them down. We see a few of them on the bus tour, but many of them are in the pedestrianised areas. Street on the left of us now, still decorated for Christmas, and the chocolate cafe called the Cocoa Works is just down there on the left, where you can enjoy your discount. I'll be talking more about York's chocolate history later on. There is quite a lot of it, but we can't fit down the street on the left, so we're taking a bigger one the Victorians built for us. And they decorated it with a lot of Victorian architecture, which we're going to pass on the right-hand side of us. First of all, the old Corn Exchange, that's now partly the Grand Opera House, a venue used by Charlie Chaplin, Laurel and Hardy, Vera Lynn.
There's the York Dungeon.
The York Dungeon on the right of us is the old Victorian Public Library. And the next grand design on the right is the Magistrates' Court from Victorian times, and it still is the court as well, not like a lot of other buildings that have been reused over the years. And on our left, another big landmark, wow. Clifford's Tower. So this is bus stop number 7, the last one in the centre of town for a bit before we take you out to hidden bits of York. So you may find yourself using this bus stop later. It's the best one for the Castle Museum, the best one of course for Clifford's Tower on the left. York Army Museum is just behind us, next door to the Hilton. And the York Army Museum is half price for the bus ticket if you fancy taking advantage of that discount. Remember to show your ticket there. You can cross the road here, go through the gates on the right, down to the riverside. The River Ouse is basically running behind the buildings on the right of us. You can do a nice riverside walk along there. Although a week ago you couldn't, because York was flooded back then, as it does on many occasions. So the building on the left of us, Clifford's Tower, is the most visible part of York's medieval castle. There's not much of the castle left now, just this central tower which was the keep. But to give you an idea of how big the original castle was, it basically covered all the land on the left of us. So if you imagine a castle wall running along the path of the road we're sitting on, up ahead of us to the roundabout and round the corner, all that land was enclosed within the castle wall. So a much bigger one than we see nowadays. But we are going to see a bit more of the castle in a few minutes, because a bit more of it is still standing. The tower on the left of us was built in the 1200s in stone. It was a wooden tower before that, built by William the Conqueror. So rebuilt in stone in the 1200s, and that's a century when a lot of building work was going on in York. The current York Minster began to be built in the 1200s. The city walls were built in stone in the 1200s. The medieval Abbey wall that was mentioned earlier, that was built in the 1200s as well, so lots going on. But as I said, the tower that originally stood on the mount to the left of us was built out of wood on William the Conqueror's orders. And it stood there for about 130 years until it burnt down during the darkest chapter in York's history, the infamous massacre of the Jewish population, which took place in 1190. What happened then in 1190, it was the start of one of the Crusades, and race riots spread across the country, not just in York, but it was particularly brutal here. And 150 Jewish people were hounded through the streets by a bloodthirsty mob. They took refuge in the tower, seeking protection from the soldiers, but the soldiers abandoned them, left them to it, surrounded by the mob for a week. And at the end of that week, the starving, frightened people inside still hadn't come out, and they knew that if they did come out, they'd be killed. So they stayed inside even when the tower was on fire, and it burnt down, killing everybody inside. So that was 1190, the darkest chapter in York's history, and it's following that the tower's rebuilt in stone, and the whole castle eventually rebuilt in stone as well. 500 soldiers stationed here, all their chapels, bakeries, farm animals, barracks, all within the castle. The tower on the left of us used to have a roof on it when it was first built, but there was a rather enthusiastic St George's Day in 1684. They got a bit carried away with a cannon salute and blew the roof off. The castle later became a prison, and this building on your left is the Georgian courtroom, and beyond it are two prison buildings that now make up the Castle Museum. And if you go into the Castle Museum, which is well worth doing, you can see some of the prison cells, including the one that Dick Turpin was held in, and the fabulous Victorian street that they recreated inside the museum. But joined onto the courtroom on your left is part of the medieval castle wall now that you can see as we pass this little corner tower. If you keep looking over your shoulder, you'll see the front of the medieval castle is still here. Most people don't know this is here. But this is where the drawbridge used to be and the main gateway into the medieval castle. So we've crossed over the River Foss, and we now leave the castle wall behind and rejoin the city walls. Hey, if you've ever wanted to see a medieval toilet chute, today's your lucky day. Look out of the right-hand window, and over the corner is a vertical shaft with a hole in the bottom. And just over the corner there, that shaft, and that's the medieval toilet chute, sending its contents into the moat back then, not onto the pavement. So don't use the loo when you're up there later, if you get a chance. Behind this hedge on the left is a graveyard. We'll be able to see into it in a minute. And there's only one gravestone still standing up, and it is the grave of Dick Turpin, the famous highwayman, held in York Jail before his execution. So on your left, towards the back, where that dog's running, there's a Dick Turpin's gravestone. And of course this is open to the public, the graveyard, not the actual tomb itself. You can wander up into the graveyard, have a look round. We've got a bus stop coming up on the left in a moment. So that's where Dick Turpin's buried, 1739, after his career of crime in other parts of the country. He wasn't a Yorkshireman, he was from down south. And he robbed people at gunpoint in highway robberies, demanding your money or your life, and sometimes taking both. Not a very nice person. Hiding out in Yorkshire, stealing horses. That's the thing that got him arrested and held in the York Castle jail and sentenced to death. But it's not the end of the story. I'll tell you what happened next a bit later on. Stay tuned. So we're heading out of the town centre. There's lots more hidden bits of York to spot along the way. Coming up next on the right, there's a lovely old medieval building that's been here for about 500 years. A white and black timber frame building on the right in just a second. It's a medieval house. It's also been a Victorian guest house, and it's now an office. And it illustrates a point about York, about our old buildings. We've got 2,000 listed buildings still standing because people reuse them rather than knocking them down. When you're out and about in the city looking for shops and places to eat and drink, you'll often find yourself in a much older building than the interiors of those shops suggest. And there are things like famous coffee shops inside Victorian banks and building societies. There's a co-op inside a church. There's all sorts of little quirky things like this to spot when you're out and about in York. Just in front of us is one of the towers in the city walls. It's now a cafe. So there's all sorts of things like that. Rather than being knocked down, they just get reused for something else. So have a look at the fronts of buildings when you're doing the shops and things later on. See what you can discover. So in front of us is one of the four main towers in the city walls. It's a place you can get on and off the city walls when they're open. But as I said before, they're not today because of the ice. But if you do get a chance, if you're here for a few days using the city walls, then this is a place you can get on and off. But you are a very long way out of town now. This is about as far out of town as you can get on the city walls. The city walls do something like a 2 3/4 mile circuit of the city. So they start off in places near stop number 1, very near the centre of town. But by the time you get about here, you've got a very long walk back behind you. And it's not very scenic either, really. We've seen the best bits. So if you do get this far, you're better off having a drink inside the tower than carrying on around the walls. Or getting on our bus, of course. Because we do have a bus stop just over your shoulder there. In a moment, we'll go through the traffic lights, through a big archway in the walls that never used to be here because the medieval people didn't need to let buses in back then. But the medieval people would come in through the Barbican, which is on the right. The Barbican sticks out at the front of the tower. It's the only Barbican left now. The others have been knocked down. You can look into it on the right. And it's a bit of a medieval death trap. People invading the city would be trapped between the archways at either end of the Barbican with the soldiers firing down on them. So it's very well protected, the city. And once it got its walls in the 1200s, nobody bothered attacking the place till 400 years later, during the English Civil War. And for 4 months the siege of York lasted, with these walls on the right of us being blasted by cannon fire for 4 months. The royalists inside York were outnumbered 7-1, so they weren't going to come out, obviously, with those odds. But Prince Rupert and the cavalry turned up, so they did come out, and that led to the Battle of Marston Moor, one of many famous battles just outside York, which York lost. And so the city was surrendered after that. Just on our left now is York Barbican Centre, our biggest indoor concert venue. So if you see shows and concerts advertised there, or if you've seen the snooker on TV in November, the UK Snooker Championships, that's where they're held. On the right of us, look out for the big golden seahorse above the entrance to the Georgian Coaching Inn, the Seahorse Hotel. Seahorses don't really look like that, do they? But nice bit of decoration anyway. It's the third one they've had in about 200 years. Coated in 24 karat gold leaf, which I don't tell everybody, so make sure it's there tomorrow. Here on the corner you've missed your chance to see ancient ruins of Mecca Bingo. They demolished them a few months ago. But behind those blackboards on your left is where there used to be a theatre called the Rialto before that was demolished to make way for the Bingo. And the Rialto Theatre played host to people like Louis Armstrong, Roy Orbison, Helen Shapiro, and a little known support act called the Beatles, who played there 4 times in 1963. They did one of those gigs without John Lennon because he'd lost his voice the night before. Another famous person to play at the Rialto in York was John Barry from York. Now his parents owned the theatre, so it was very easy to get a gig there. He's very talented as well. He became an Oscar-winning composer. Did Dances with Wolves, Born Free, Out of Africa, and 11 of the best James Bond themes. Now on your left you can see the River Foss, the lock system, where it meets up with the flood barrier and the River Ouse. The flood barrier can deal with 8.5 metres of extra water, but it's not enough. They do need 9.5, because all this was flooded on your left last week. These cars wouldn't have been here back then because the car park was underwater. So now we go over the River Ouse, our biggest river, and there's a lovely view to the left, but there's another one to the right as well. So try and do both as we go over. Right is looking towards town, left is downstream. At the riverfront you can see some of the old Victorian warehouses that have now been turned into flats. The River Ouse is our bigger river. It flows south from here and just meets up with the River Foss, not far from here. On your right is where a second York castle used to stand, on this mound that now has the city walls on it. But there was a second wooden castle here, built on William the Conqueror's orders and burnt down a year later by the Northern rebels. William the Conqueror, I think, would like us to think that he conquered the whole country in 1066, but he didn't. It took him several years to deal with the troublesome north. He did do in the end. He killed everybody, burnt all the farmland, left Yorkshire as a wasteland for decades afterwards. But this area is very thriving these days. Bishopthorpe Road, loved by the locals, queuing outside the shops and cafes even on a Sunday. So very popular with the locals. Not many tourists get out here to Bishopthorpe Road, but of course you can, because you know it's here now. York's best kept secret. And there is a bus stop coming up on the left in a moment, if you fancy exploring and seeing what all the fuss is about. Often voted High Street of the Year and coolest place to live in national surveys. It's also got York's smallest house on it, which we're going to go past on the left in a moment, in a very narrow gap between 76 and 78. So if you start looking to your left now, these big white bay windows on the left are 76. Look down the narrow gap for a black door in the gap, just coming up on your left now. And it's 76A, the little house in that narrow gap on the left. Isn't that amazing, eh? Apparently it's even bigger at the back, but I don't think they have a double bed. So ahead of us, there's a big factory in the distance that we're going to get a lot closer to. One of our old chocolate factories, and that's the direction we're taking you now, on a big loop out of town. So on the way, I've got a chance to talk to you about York's chocolate history, perhaps make you feel a bit hungry. Behind these houses on the left is a park called Rowntree Park. It's named after the famous Rowntree company that was in the city for many years. And the factory that we're heading towards is another one, the famous Terry's factory. So two big names in York's chocolate history, Terry's and Rowntree's. They both started out in Victorian times with little shops selling other things. So Rowntree's were importers of tea and coffee and chocolate when chocolate was a very expensive drink. Back in Victorian times, so that was how they started out. And Terry's started out as a confectioners, making things like marzipan, jars of marmalade, and an early version of Love Heart sweets that were called conversation lozenges back in Victorian times. But both of them branched out into chocolate, into bars of chocolate late on in Victorian times, and in the 20th century the chocolate bars became more popular than drinking chocolate. So in York, Rowntree's were making things like Kit Kats, Smarties, After Eights, the famous Yorkie bar. If you've ever wondered why they call it that, hopefully you've figured it out now. Yeah. And Terry's of York, out on this side of town, this is where they were making their famous chocolate orange.
Oh, chocolate orange.
Production moved abroad in 2005, so the factory is no longer in use, but it's still standing and it's been turned into apartments now. And in a moment we'll be able to see it on the left. But lots of new houses been built in front of it. There's a whole new sort of housing complex and shops and leisure centres and things going to appear. So the first glimpse we get of the old chocolate factory, the Terry's factory, is only a glimpse down the next street on the left. But you see a big brown building with a huge clock tower, and on your left now you can get your first glimpse of it. But we are going to get better views of it. So that's where all the chocolate oranges were made until 2005. It's a 1930s building. And chocolate was the second biggest employer in the city, and the biggest source of jobs for women, including the mother of comedian Frankie Howerd. So if you keep looking through the gaps in the trees over your left shoulder, you'll be able to see the chocolate factory a lot better in a moment. You might even be able to read the clock tower and realise that around the dial it says Terry's York instead of numbers. So the best view of it is over your left shoulder now, the old Terry's factory. You could fit a lot of chocolate in there, couldn't you? It's huge. It's about 5 stories tall. So there's a lot of new apartments appearing in there, and a few other things as well. It's another of our listed buildings, of course, this. So one of the Queen's visits to York when she was a princess was to the Terry's factory, and from what I've read she came out with a lot of free samples as well. Later on in her career she visited the racecourse, which is the next set of buildings on your left. So this is York Races, and Royal Ascot was held here in 2005, and that's when the Queen and Prince Philip came to see it. 2005, of course, is the year that the chocolate factory stopped producing as well. But further back in time, the smell of chocolate wafted over the racecourse, and sales of chocolate went up on race days, apparently. Not surprising, really. This vast expanse of grass on your left, the racecourse, known as the Knaves Mire, has played host to fairs and circuses, a visit from the Pope, a prisoner of war camp during World War II, hot air balloon rides in nice weather, and it became a lake when York flooded in 2000. All this was covered by water and there were boats sailing on it. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show were here in 1904, pitched up on the grass to your left. And I mentioned the Pope as well. The only time the Popes visited York was in the 1980s, and there were 200,000 people gathered on the grass to the left to see that. So loads of events, music events, sporting events, fairs and circuses. But the most fun for all the family for hundreds of years was to come out this way and watch a public execution. This is where they used to take place. Dick Turpin in 1739, one of many executed here, amongst the trees on the far side where the ground starts to rise. And that's where Dick Turpin was brought in 1739, and I'll finish off his story now. He knew what was coming, bought himself a new coat and a pair of shoes for the occasion to look his best. A crowd of people gathered, including professional mourners that he'd hired for the occasion, and then he jumped off with the noose round his neck, depriving the hangman of the job. Still not the end of the story though, because then his body was put on display in a local pub. Now they don't do that sort of thing nowadays, do they? But you know, they didn't have Sky Sports back then. Still not the end of the story, because some people stole the body when it was first buried, and it was another 3 days after his death before the body was retrieved and reburied in the graveyard that we saw earlier. And that is the end of the story. But not from York, was he? But there is another famous criminal who was, and that's Guy Fawkes.
Yeah.
So Guy Fawkes was born in York about 400 years ago. Near to York Minster, there's a couple of places that claim to be the exact spot. What is known is that he went to school very close to the Minster when St Peter's School used to have its premises there. And of course later on he tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament, where lots of anti-Catholic laws were coming from, and he converted to Catholicism and witnessed the persecution of Catholics across the country and in York as well. In fact, about 30 were executed in York during Guy Fawkes' lifetime, and about 40 more after his death. So a very difficult time to live through, and Guy Fawkes was very angry about that. That's why he tried to blow up the Parliament, and of course he failed. And across the country we still celebrate his horrible torture and execution every 5th of November. We wave a few sparklers around and light the fireworks and maybe burn an effigy of him on a bonfire. But guess what? His old school don't. And for 400 years, St. Peter's School, now on different premises, have never celebrated bonfire night in all that time, with him being one of their ex-pupils. Another famous person with a happier story went to school in York, and her name is Judi Dench, the famous actress. And her old school is down the next street on the left. A Victorian boarding school for girls called the Mount. It's a big cream Victorian building, and it's down the next street on the left. So it's where Judi Dench went to school. A couple of famous writers as well, Margaret Drabble and A.S. Byatt. They went to school at the Mount as well. Which is you'll get a glimpse of the building down the street to the left in a moment. So Judi Dench began her acting career in York as an angel, aged 7, in the York Mystery Plays, which are a bit like a nativity play on wheels that takes place out in the open air. The Queen came to watch the Mystery Plays back in the 1950s, I think it was, but the weather was so bad it got rained off on that occasion. So Judi Dench later became famous. She's been James Bond's boss, Lady Macbeth, Queen Elizabeth I she's been on screen, and Queen Victoria as well. And it all began here in York when she was born as the daughter of a local doctor. So that's the Mount School down to the left. The road we're taking into York is the main route into York from the south, following the path of an old Roman road, so it's been the main road for about 2,000 years. And lots of Roman remains turn up in people's gardens along here. Behind these houses on your left, a few years ago, 80 Roman gladiator skeletons turned up. 45 of them had had their heads chopped off in the Roman arena. And some had even been bitten by lions. So there's some very bloodthirsty games going on in Roman York. But nobody knows where, because the Roman arena's never turned up. But there must have been one. York was an important Roman town on the frontier. Many emperors passing through, many armies basing themselves here over the centuries. The Emperor Septimius Severus died in York in the early 200s at the age of 70, one of the few emperors to live that long. And the Emperor Constantine was proclaimed in York in the early 300s, and he went on to be the emperor who spread Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. So there's a statue of him outside York Minster now, in the spot where the Fortress HQ used to be. Another of our listed buildings coming up on the left, a much more recent one, a 1930s cinema. This beautiful curved Art Deco building on the left is one of the original Odeons. It's still a cinema today, but it's not an Odeon anymore. But above the main entrance on the left, you can see the Odeon sign still up there because it's a listed building. They just light up the E now in the neon sign for Everyman, the chain that runs it these days. And in front of us is Micklegate Bar Tower, the main entrance into the city walls from the south. The one that all the visiting royalty have gone through on an open-top bus, of course, just like you. King Charles himself, but he came in his limo, he didn't come on the bus. Just a few months ago, that's the way King Charles went through. And over the centuries, to impress all the visiting royalty, the citizens of York would display the heads of traitors on the tower in front of us. The most famous head to go up there was a member of the royal family, in fact. It was a chap called the Duke of York. Not that one. Richard the Duke of York in 1460. He lost his head after losing a battle in Yorkshire during the Wars of the Roses. And he was the king's cousin. He had a better claim to the throne than the king at the time. But lost the battle. And his sons later won the Battle of Towton just outside York and swapped his head for those of his enemies. And they became Richard III and Edward IV. On your left is a big green beetle painted onto the wall. A tansy beetle, not as big as this in real life, but they live on the banks of the river in York and hardly anywhere else in the country.
There's a train station right there.
York's Victorian railway station coming up on the left. But a few decades before it was built, there used to be a station on your right. And you can just see on the right the tips of these big archways that used to let the steam trains through the city walls. The Victorians weren't so bothered about our heritage at first, so they hacked through the ancient walls with planning permission and let the trains in. But it wasn't a very big or practical station, the old one, because back in the 1830s and 40s, the trains would go through the city walls and then stop, and then they'd have to come back out again, reverse back out, because there's a river in the way if they keep going. As one driver discovered in 1871, when he did in fact keep going and push 23 wagons of coal into the River Ouse. So they clearly needed a bigger station, and this one on your left was the biggest in the world when they opened it in 1877. You can see the York Tap on the left there, the old Victorian tea room, features in the film Chariots of Fire. The station does a bit of acting in the first Harry Potter movie as well. Our only real connection to Harry Potter, when Harry and Hagrid walk over our footbridge. It's about 10 seconds of the first movie. It's meant to be King's Cross, but we've got a better footbridge. There is one other Harry Potter connection actually. The actor who played Mr. Filch, the caretaker at Hogwarts, he's from York as well. There's a little bit of a connection there. Another famous person from York, along with Judi Dench, Frankie Howard, Mark Addy from Game of Thrones and the Full Monty. So the railways, they're a massive part of our heritage, bigger even than chocolate. The railways were our biggest source of jobs for many years, and at its height, in the early 20th century, 5,000 people employed in the railways in York, many of them in a massive carriage works that used to be building the old Victorian and Edwardian carriages not far from here. A hotel on your left was part of the railways as well. That was built onto the end of the station platform, so that the wealthy Victorian passengers could get straight off the train and straight into their hotel, drop off their toothbrushes, put on their best outfits and go promenading along the city walls and the riverside paths. And that's what they liked to do, the first Victorian tourists. That's what they came for, to be seen rather than see the sights. And at first, as I said, the Victorians weren't so bothered about our heritage being a tourist attraction, and they knocked through the city walls to build roads and railways, knocked bits of it down. But they began to realise the value of the heritage later on, and the history began to draw in the tourists as well, and growing us doors into the tourist attraction we are today, if I do say so myself. So the hotel was playing host to many Victorian passengers brought by the trains, but they got a bit ambitious when they named it. They called it the Royal Hotel, in anticipation of the royal visits coming by train and the kings and queens staying here, but none of them ever did, so they changed the name after a bit. It's not the Royal Hotel anymore. Johnny Depp stayed there last summer, and many jockeys at York races have stayed there over the years. You'll see how big it is in a moment. We're only outside the small end of the hotel at the moment, so when we go through the traffic lights, if you look over your left shoulder, you'll see it stretching into the distance like a huge palace. The man who brought the railways to York, George Hudson, we saw his house earlier, number 44, when I pointed that out. George Hudson became known as the Railway King. And at the centre of his railway empire was York, the town he was also a mayor of at one point, and he was also a local MP. And he invested in the railways at a time when they were very new and exciting, back in the 1830s and 40s, and built a third of Britain's railways, became a celebrity and a friend of Queen Victoria. But then he was found out that he was doing some very dodgy things with his money, including bribing his fellow MPs to pass acts of parliament that he wanted to go through, and paying out dividends that the company couldn't afford, and it all came crumbling down around him. And so there's no statue of George Hudson nowadays. There is a statue of his rival on the right, George Lehman, another railway chairman, but Hudson doesn't get a statue. He only got a road named after him 100 years after his death. Despite what he did, of course, for York's economy. But it proves that crime doesn't pay, doesn't it? The stop where we're at now is in the Memorial Gardens, laid out in honour of the soldiers of the First World War. And in front of us is where you find our famous York Railway Museum, the National Railway Museum. It's a short walk from this bus stop, just straight in front of us. There's a big railway bridge and some massive buildings on the other side of the bridge. That's where the museum is. And of course the buildings are massive because it's a railway museum. It's full of trains, isn't it? Loads of them. Including Mallard, which broke the steam speed record in the 1930s and still holds it today. Stephenson's rocket, they've got a replica of that in there. There's a Japanese bullet train. So diesel engines as well as steam engines, electric trains as well. Queen Victoria's railway carriage, that's in there.
Yeah,
that's a bit posh.
It's still on today
like this, really.
That train.
She was travelling in style, was Queen Victoria. It gives a new meaning to the phrase first class when you see it. If you've ever bought a first class ticket, I think you've been ripped off, really, compared to her.
Faster than the UK trains. What
So when they opened the railways, very exciting time. You could catch a train from York to London in the 1840s for the first time ever. And it would only take you 14 hours to get there. Not bad.
Japanese bullet train. So we get that from Birmingham to London.
You do it in 2 hours nowadays on a good day.
14 hours to get from York to London.
So we've looked round, we're passing George Lehman's statue again. He was also a mayor and solicitor of York, as well as being a railway chairman and a rival of George Hudson. Now as we go around this corner, we go through another archway in the city walls. And if you look to your right for a moment, you'll see a big brown building with many chimneys. So nowadays it's the Grand Hotel, a 5-star hotel. It gives you an idea of how important the railways were, because that used to be the railway office before it became a 5-star hotel. The North Eastern Railways HQ. More great views of the River Ouse now as we go over this bridge back into town. The riverside paths on your left are called Dame Judi Dench Walk. Over on the right is the medieval Guildhall. Got bombed during the Blitz in World War II. Had to be rebuilt. A great thing you can do while you're in York is go through the gates on your left into the museum gardens, where there are 3 massive ancient ruins and loads of wildlife. You can see it all for free inside the museum gardens. The Roman fortress ruin, the medieval abbey, the medieval hospital, all in there. Directly in front of us, our most famous building, York Minster. We're looking at the west front of York Minster now, and the big window in front of us has got a heart shape in the top. It's called the Heart of Yorkshire, and it's said that if you kiss your loved one beneath the heart of Yorkshire, you'll be happy together forever. Read the small print first though. It's a long time, isn't it? Forever. So read the small print, terms and conditions do apply. So the Minster, it's the 5th York Minster that we've had. The first one was built out of wood back in Anglo-Saxon times. replaced with the stone one that burnt down, replaced with the third minster that also burnt down, and then a fourth. Guess what? That burnt down as well. So the fifth one they started building in 1220, and it only took 252 years to finish it. It's been the venue for the first female bishop in the Church of England to be consecrated. It was also the wedding venue for King Edward III, back when it didn't have a roof. And he booked it for his wedding and he didn't know it didn't have a roof, and he got snowed on his wedding day, poor thing. So we're back at stop number one. Now, if of course you all got on here at stop number one an hour ago, and if you wanted you could get off. You're very close to the Minster, the art gallery, the museum gardens, the shops. It can give you directions, but you don't have to get off. If you want to stay on, and we'll drop you off at somewhere en route that